Professor Kevin MacDonald. He's a professor of psychology from the University of California in Long Beach. Welcome to the program, sir.
It's actually California State University in Long Beach. Yeah.
Thank you. California State University, Long Beach. Welcome to the program, Professor MacDonald.
Hi, yeah.
You wrote a few books about Judaism.
Yeah.
And basically what I would like to do, I would like you to kind of give a background, name these books, and at the same time give a background about all these books, and then we'll go have some questions for you.
Okay, well, my background is in evolutionary biology and psychology, and so I decided to write about Judaism from an evolutionary point of view. So the first book was called The People That Shall Dwell Alone. The subtitle is Judaism as a Group Evolutionary Strategy. And the basic idea is that Jews have been a cohesive group for, for thousands of years. They've stayed together. They've been separate, and they've always married each other. And so that as soon as you see a group like that, it has evolutionary implications because you're basically cutting off the gene pool from other groups. They've also, basically. I have a chapter on resource competition between Jews and non-Jews. I talk about how Jewish groups worked over history. That is, altruism within the group, Jewish charity, because Jewish groups had very strong ties of charity, a great deal of commitment within the group. And I talk about intelligence, that the Jews had a very long history of selecting for intelligence, that the smarter people would marry each other, that if a person achieved a lot of wealth in business or something like that, he would marry his daughter to a scholar who was who had a mastery of the Jewish religious works and so on. So that created a sort of very, very wealthy, very intelligent class at the top of Jewish society, and it's this group that has essentially been responsible for how powerful and influential Jewish groups have been at various times in history. So then the second book was about anti-Semitism. It's called Separation as Discontents. It's about anti-Semitism. I started out with a theoretical chapter on psychology of in-groups and out-groups, basically saying that from the psychological point of view, we expect to find that if you have groups that are separated and clearly marked, and if you think about Jews in societies throughout history, they've often been very easily distinguishable. They wear different clothing, often speak a different language and so on. That there's a tendency to produce psychological conflict under those circumstances. So I talk about anti-Semitism throughout history, basically as resource competition. The Jews and non-Jews have often been involved in resource competition in different times and places, and that various anti-Jewish movements have grown up based on those kind of conflicts. When I talk about Jewish self-deception, that they tend not to really analyze their own status very, very well in terms of they tend to blame outsiders for all the problems, that they tend not to see themselves as ever, causing the problems that they have, that sort of thing.
But now, Professor MacDonald, I mean, you took these from a scientific point of view, not from a political point of view, right?
Yeah, these are based on Jewish. Actually, I think most of it is based on Jewish historians and so on. The attempt is to find is to develop a sort of theory. Again, my basic background is evolutionary biology. To think of this as group conflict over history, and how that affects, ultimately what kind of gene frequencies are going to be present in the population. So we talk, about Jewish reproductive success in different times and places, and also the reproductive success of non-Jewish groups. So it's always the attempt is to be objective. The attempt is to be scientific as best as I can, and I often try to bring psychological theories that are current, that reflect modern psychological research, like social identity theory, all the research on intelligence and IQ testing and so on, population genetic research, a whole lot of stuff. So it's an attempt to bring this into the scientific realm, to bring the social sciences to think of that group as, from a scientific, objective, rational kind of perspective. And then my third book is called The Culture of Critique. It's basically about several very, very influential Jewish intellectual movements, how they organized, kinds of influence they had. And the basic idea is that at the core of these movements, you had people who strongly who were Jews, but they also had a very strong sense that these movements were an attempt to satisfy Jewish interests. That they for example, psychoanalysis. There was part of psychoanalysis was a radical criticism of non-Jewish Western culture.
Now let me ask you this. Now Jewishness is not an ethnic group, is it?
Yes, it is, and absolutely. I mean, it certainly it always has had. It has been. Theological. They've had religion and so on.
Well, yeah, but I mean, okay, now, okay, Islam is not an ethnic group. It's a religion. Christianity is not an ethnic group. It's a religion. Buddhism, you have the same thing, all religions. Why only Judaism would be considered as an ethnic group? I mean, to me, an ethnic group is people of the same stock. Like you might say white people or black people or Americans or Japanese but I mean, you have Jews who are from all over the world. So how could that be an ethnic group?
Well, if you look at the population genetics, you can actually see that these people do have, they come essentially, they are part of the Middle Eastern gene pool.
Well, how could that be when you have white European Jews, and then you have Jews in Africa and Yemen, and then you have Jews in Europe, you have Jews in the Middle East? How could that be? I mean, I can look at them and I can give you different types of Jews: white, black, Middle Eastern. So I don't understand your last statement.
Well, there's certainly been some admixture as they've gone to other places. But if you look at the population genetics, you can still see the ancestry. In other words, they have retained their ethnic integrity. If you look at Jewish religious practices and their marriage practices over the centuries, they've been very, very concerned to marry within the group. Apparently some of the Jewish groups started as Jewish men going to these other places like Europe and actually intermarrying with local women in the first generation, and then sort of closing it off. They can actually tell that now by doing the population by looking at the population genetic research. But you can still, in other words, they retain their ethnic integrity, and it very, very clearly intends to do so. I mean, they try not to just have marriages indiscriminately with everybody around. They tend
can you define the word ethnic for me?
Well, ethnic I think does have a biological connotation. It has the connotation that people have the same biological background. Like you say, Japanese, I think is an ethnic designation. You talk about white people, African; those are ethnic. But if you think about Muslim, it's not really, because it's spread over many parts of the world with very different ethnic groups.
Well, the same thing with Jews. Now, you do know that most Jews in the world today are the Khazars Jews, the Khazar, and those people, they converted to Judaism in Europe.
Well, I disagree with that theory. I talk about that theory in my second book. There's really very little basis on which that's based. If you look at the population genetics, it just doesn't look that way.
But I mean, speaking of genetics, genetics testing was done, and European Jews have nothing to do with the Jews who came from Palestine 2,000 years ago.
I just think that's wrong. I mean, I can send you the population genetic research. It looks to me like there's a very strong Middle Eastern genetic component.
Well, you know what? I'm going to have to get you on. I'm going to have to get you on the show with a professor of genetics, and have you guys. One of you will try to convince the other. Okay. Now, tell me about. Okay, we're going to get off the ethnic thing. You also talked about the Jews, the influence of Jews in the United States.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, it's part of the whole project. When you think about about conflict between ethnic groups, Jews have their own interests, so they sometimes conflict with other people. I think Israel's a prominent example where Jews tend to support Israel pretty much no matter what. But I don't think those interests are always the same as the rest of Americans. So there are conflicts of interest, and then you want to see how does this resolve? What sorts of power relationships are there? It's just it becomes that sort of analysis. You want to understand the influence of these activist groups on public policy, because you assume that the conflicts of interest is a basic sort of postulate that we don't have the same interests in this sort of thing.
Okay. Now, you also talked about, in your first book, you've talked about the communism and how it started, the Bolshevik Revolution?
Yeah. In the Culture of Critique, I have a chapter on Jews in the left, and I talk about Jewish involvement in communism. I also have a rather long review of Yuri Slezkin's book coming out soon on the Jewish Century, a very interesting book. But yes, there's no question that Jews were absolutely instrumental to the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, and they formed a very upper class, very powerful group in the Soviet Union, at least till after World War II.
So are you saying that communism started by Jews?
Well, I'm saying that Jews were very influential players in it, and that the Bolshevik Revolution would not have happened without Jewish support. If you look at Slezkin's book and all the stuff that I review in my Culture of Critique, I think that's the conclusion you have to come to. There's no question that the Soviet Union was very much the top echelons of power. That Jews were vastly overrepresented in all areas of the Soviet hierarchy, at the top of the hierarchy. Again, at least until after World War II, when they started to decline, you started to see anti-Semitism increasingly after World War II, and eventually quite a few of them emigrated elsewhere, including quite a few to Israel.
Now, okay, you describe in the book, your first book, the Critique, the Culture of Critique.
Yeah.
You describe how Jewish intellectuals initiated and advanced a number of important intellectual and political movements during the 20th century, and you argued that these movements are attempts to alter Western societies in a manner that would neutralize or end anti-Semitism and enhance the prospects for Jewish group continuity, etc., etc. What other movements, I mean, you talked about communism, what other movement in the 20th century that Jews have initiated?
Well, in the Culture of Critique, which is my third book, by the way, I talk about Wazin anthropology. They were very opposed to any expression of ethnocentrism on the part of Europeans. They completely denied that race or ethnicity existed at a biological level and that sort of thing. I talked about psychoanalysis, which essentially they had one of the main points of psychoanalysis was to produce theories of anti-Semitism, in which anti-Semitism was viewed as a complete aberration psychologically. It was a psychiatric disorder, and so on. So in other words, to make anti-Jewish attitudes into pathologies, things that were actually something a psychiatrist should deal with, rather than a social scientist interested in group conflict. I talk about the Frankfurt School of Social Research, which was also influenced very much by psychoanalysis and the left and Marxism, and that move was very influential in even now. If you look at academic departments of literature and history and so on, a lot of influence of the Frankfurt School, sort of leftist intellectual perspective. In which any kind of group allegiance that Europeans had to their own group, their own ethnicity, is viewed as a pathology. Whereas, but of course, when they talk about, they simply did not talk about Jewish group allegiance. In fact, they were all very strongly Jewish themselves. had strong group loyalties. But if you look at their theories, group loyalty on the part of non-Jews was simply pathology. It was not. It was just beyond the pale.
So, what is anti-Semitism?
Well, anti-Semitism can be defined a lot of different ways, and I think it tends to be defined as sort of any kind of negative attitude towards Jews at all. I think it should be defined. Well, that's okay, I think, but you know, it's possible to have rational anti-Semitism in the sense that people can have rational disagreements, rational conflicts of interest with Jews. I mean, I think our policy in the Middle East right now is a good example, where Jewish interests do not really, you know, I don't think, coincide with the interests of the rest of quite a few Americans. So that there are conflicts of interest. Now, if I'm opposed to what the AIPAC wants as far as our foreign policy, does that make me anti-Semitic? Well, I don't know.
Well, I mean, is it? Is it?
I don't know. I think Abe Foxman in the ADL would probably say it was anti-Semitic. But
so I mean, scientifically, I mean, you are a professor, and you did a lot of research. How would you describe anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism?
Yeah,
well, again, I would say that it's negative attitudes towards Jews because of their group membership, and so then you have to have the idea that Jews do behave as a group at some level, and so then, you know, actually quite a bit of my analysis focuses on the organized Jewish community, because you can't talk about individual Jews. Individual Jews, there's a lot of variation, but what you have to do is look at what is the thrust of the organized Jewish community, whether it's looking at immigration policy, our policy in the Middle East, civil rights legislation, church and state issues. Jewish organizations have tended to take a certain view of that. They've been more or less unanimous about it, and all the thrust of Jewish influence and power has been directed in certain ways on those issues. It's not been random. So their power has been directed to achieve certain interests in certain directions. And if I say that, some people would call that anti-Semitism. I think it may be, but if it is, that's simply a rational analysis of the situation. Then, you know, some anti-Semitism has to be viewed as rational. I mean, quite a bit of anti-Semitism is not, because a lot of times anti-Jewish theories, they get completely wild. Jews are responsible for everything that's bad, goes bad in the world. You know, they're running everything, and I think there's a tendency to exaggerate Jewish influence. But at the same time, you know, what has happened in our country is that we can't discuss Jewish interests openly. We can't just, you know, like any other group. When we talk about black power, people would talk about the power of African Americans in our society, what it is, what its limitations are. But we can't do that with Jews. It's like it's beyond the pale. And as soon as you start talking about it, people get all upset and all uptight. They start, you know, getting very defensive.
Now, Jews have tried and succeeded, actually, in altering the immigration of white Europeans into the United States, and they preferred other people, like people of other minorities besides white. Why?
That's right.
Why is that?
Well, I think there's several reasons. One is that they view... They have quite a few of the activists express the idea that if America remains a white European country, they will turn against the Jews, just as in Nazi Germany. You know, eventually you had the development of a movement that was anti-Jewish and extremely anti-Jewish, wanted the Jews out of Germany, wanted to persecute the Jews, and so on. So they're worried about that, and then they had the idea that if you bring in a lot of other groups, you're going to prevent this sort of thing from happening. You're actually making white Europeans less powerful, and I think that has been the case.
But actually, it worked the opposite, though, because white Europeans are more sympathetic to Jews than these other minority groups. Actually, there is resistance for Jews and Jewishness in other than white ethnic groups.
You know, I agree, and some Jews agree with that. There's this guy, Stephen Steinlein. He's made that point, that bringing Muslims into this country is not in the interest of Jews, because Muslims tended to obviously take the view that Israel is a problem in the Middle East. That's the case. And some Jews have taken the view that we should restrict immigration from Muslim countries, and other countries likely to be anti-Jewish. Well, so far, though, the main Jewish organizations have not gotten behind that. And I think it's short-sighted. I think that in the long run, they may be making a big mistake. But the other reason that Jewish organizations have, and Jews in general, have been opposed, that have favored favored immigration policies favoring other groups, is that they have a deep resentment about the exclusionary policies that we had in this country between 1924 and 1965. They viewed that they thought that was anti-Jewish. They thought that the 1924 law was directed against Jews. In a certain extent, it was, because Jews coming over at that time, they tended to be on the far left. A lot of them were very sympathetic towards communism. It was a very turbulent time. And so, yeah, they have hostility. They have historical grudges about the older culture in this country. And I think that's reflected in a lot of Hollywood movies, and in a lot of our literature now is the older culture of America is under critique. And that's sort of what the point of my book, The Culture of Critique, is that this new culture that's been so powerful since 1965 is a culture of criticizing the older culture of this country. The older, white-dominated European culture of this country has become under a microscope and deeply criticized as pathological.
Okay. So are they trying to reverse that immigration policy now? Like
I
get
think
more
some of them
European?
are. Stephen Steinlein is, but so far I still have yet to see any major Jewish organization come out for immigration restrictions. Instead, what you do see is that Jewish organizations are networking with immigrant groups of various kinds, and they are, they're trying to make bridges to other groups like Mexican Americans and other groups, and of course quite a high percentage of the immigrants are Mexican and Latin American and so on. So yeah, they are trying to create these coalitions. I think they are adopting the strategy that they always had to sort of increase the power of non-white groups. I think that's one of the main agendas.
Okay. Now you also talked about the media controlled by the Jews also in your books.
Well, I don't use the word control, but yes, Jews I think have been the strongest influence, the single most identifiable influence in the American media. If you look at Hollywood, all the studios traditionally have been owned by Jews. Great number of the newspapers, television networks, and so on. So I review that what was available in year 2002, I think, in the preface to the paperback edition of Culture of Critique.
Now, in your research, where did they come up? I mean, it takes billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars. Where did they come up with all that money?
Well, the Jews are very wealthy, and if you look at, one of the points of the first book is that Jews tend to be intelligent, and they tend to be very good businessmen. So this has translated into extraordinary economic success. And Jews have been very generous when it comes to political contributions. And I think they've been very concerned about the media. They know the power of the media. And so they have been concerned that if the media fell into non-Jewish hands, it would be a very serious kind of problem. They would worry that it would turn against them. And so Jews have, if you look at it, it's interesting. If you look in other countries, like in Russia, after the fall of communism, Jews got in there and tried to influence the media. Actually, I think they've been thrown out to some extent of that. But there's still a strong tendency for Jews to gravitate to media in a lot of different countries. And I don't think it's accidental. I think that they see that as a source of influence.
Now, how is the tolerance or intolerance of non-Jews in society like the United States? Is the society growing? I mean, did it get used to be intolerant, or do you see an intolerance movement growing out there?
I don't know. I see. I think it's complicated. I do see some signs that European Americans may be sort of coalescing together more. I think the Republican Party is getting more and more white. I think certain, Christian religious groups are getting more and more white, but they're not consciously white. It's sort of what I call implicit whiteness. They're sort of, these organizations are becoming white. Even things like NASCAR. If you look at entertainment, I think there's more of a tendency to sort of coalesce into white groups, but they're not pro-white, and you still have this very dominant attitude that any expression of white interest or white ethnocentrism is a pathology, despite the fact that all other ethnic groups in this country openly are ethnocentric, advance their interests. They have, Mexican American Legal Defense for Education Fund. You got the NAACP and all these other groups that advance the interests of various ethnic groups, but there are no groups that advance the ethnic interests of European Americans. It's strange, and I think in the future it might change, especially if Europeans become a minority. I mean, Europeans are slated to become a minority in this country within, say, 45 years. That's not very long, and so I would anticipate that sometime before the year 2050.
Professor, we're going to pick up that question when we come back in the second hour. There will be a break for 5 minutes, so if you can just hang on with us, we will pick up that.
How long will we talk after that?
Yes, we will talk about 15, 20 minutes after that. I won't keep you for the whole hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we only have 10 seconds to say that we will pick up where we left off in the first hour, and we will have Professor MacDonald with us. We will see you in 5 minutes. With Professor Kevin MacDonald, professor of psychology, wrote few books about Judaism and the influence of Judaism and the influence of Judaism in some movements in the 20th century. And Professor, are you back with us?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm here.
There is something, I'm curious, why is it in the United States, in the conscience of the United States, it's okay to talk about being Arab. It's okay talking about being Muslim and being proud of it. It's okay to talk about being black and being proud of it. Why is it not okay to talk about white and being proud of it?
Yeah, I think in a way that's sort of what the book, The Culture Critique, is about. Those Jewish intellectual movements, they pathologize any kind of sense of group membership, group allegiance, group pride of white people.
But I mean, they're allowing the Muslims to do it. They're allowing the Italians to do it. They're allowing blacks to do it. They're allowing everybody except whites. When you talk about white, then you are a racist. Then you are neo-Nazi. Then you are all these names. What is it about being white? And also, unfortunately, also, most whites actually are afraid to talk about them being white. I mean, the consciousness of white, it's like, oh, I'm not going to touch that subject. So they succeeded, actually. So the Jews have succeeded in getting this.
It's the biggest taboo that we have in our society. But there's no other taboo anywhere closer. I mean, certainly discussing Jewish issues might be a close second. But yeah, it's an absolute taboo, and people get very, anxietous, about the very thought of it. They've actually got these studies, the psychological studies now, where if people are consciously aware of ethnic outgroups, white people will tend to they can actually override their sort of subconscious prejudices. White people still have what they call implicit pro-white attitudes. They're subtle. They're unconscious. They have certain tests that they can these social psychologists can do to find these out. But at the conscious level, as soon as they talk to people, they suppress those things. So it's this conscious taboo. It's like social respectability. People simply. It's been a long propaganda. I mean, and if you look at the Culture Critique, I talk about some of the activism, the Jewish activist group. You've had mass education. The media has been saturated with this since the 1960s. You look at a television programs like All in the Family. You know, white people who had racialist attitudes were viewed as stupid, as you know, and stupid was the number one thing, by the way. I mean, as having no intelligence, as being brutish, as being evil. And that mass media campaign has been extraordinarily successful. I think most white people, the very thought of expressing their own ethnic interest, and they immediately, because I talk to people about it sometimes, and because you do, they immediately clam up, they change the subject, they express sort of conventional views about these things, and they're completely unabashed. When they read Mexicans asserting their ethnic pride, they don't, okay, it doesn't matter. They don't really worry about that.
So let me ask you something. I mean, something comes to my mind now. We're changing on a lot of like the Census Bureau and a lot of descriptions. We're changing the word black into African Americans. Do you see the word white going away? And if it does, what would we replace it with?
Sometimes you hear European American as a replacement. It's not bad because it's sort of Europe as a cultural, biological area of origin. You know, in the same way Africa is the origin of African Americans, Europe is the origin of European Americans, and so there's. So
is there like a movement out there to change that from white to European Americans?
I think it might, yeah.
And
in some ways
I mean, what do you think about that?
I don't know. I think it's probably a good idea. Yeah.
Just to forget about anything called white.
Partly because whiteness has sort of been pathologized. People don't want to think in those terms, and they have intense guilt about that. But if you talk about European Americans, people would say, "Well, got Mexican Americans."
Now let me ask you a question. In your research, when you bring this up, would white people be susceptible to the idea of forgetting about them being white and being European Americans? I mean, are they more like they like the idea, or are they resenting the idea?
I still think at the conscious level they are resisting it. I don't think that any pro-white or European American group has had any success at the mass level. I mean, they're tiny groups with no influence. I don't see that as but again, I see this at the implicit level, that people are coalescing, that people leave cities to go to the suburbs where they can find other white people. They go to churches with white people. They watch sports on TV, and so I think it's happening, but it's not. When they do this, they aren't conscious saying, "I'm white," I'm doing this. They're conscious saying, "Well, I want to go to a better school. I want to get away from the violence or something," but they don't say, "I want to be close to white people." They don't ever conceptualize it that way.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we're going to go take a couple of phone calls.
Okay.
Now, Charles Lindbergh, you wrote about Charles Lindbergh in your book.
Yeah.
He was opposed to World War II, and actually he spent a lot of effort to stop the United States from going to World War II. Tell me why.
Well, I think part of his reason was he just had this traditional sense of America as being not part of Europe's quarrels, but he also had this deep antipathy towards the Soviet Union. He viewed the Soviet Union as more horrifying, I think, than he viewed Germany. And so if Philip Roth wrote a book recently, thinking about what would happen if Lindbergh had been president, the idea would be that he might have made an alliance with Nazi Germany, because he was more sympathetic, I think, towards that.
But now tell me why he was attacked.
People.
Now the Jews wanted to get the United States to get involved in the war, and Lindbergh was saying we have the Americans and the United States don't have any interest in this war, and he was fought fiercely by the Jews.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah,
so I mean, what you're saying is the Jews were the drive behind America entering Second World War.
Well, I'm not saying, I wouldn't say that they were the only factor by any means. I mean, we have a long-standing alliance with Britain, and Britain certainly tried. Churchill wanted the West to side against Hitler and with Russia, with Soviet Union. So there were other forces here. In history, you can't usually reduce things to a single variable, and that's true there. But Jews did have significant power in the United States at that time, and they used what power they had. They did not have as much power then as they do now, or they had after, say, 1965. But their power was significant. I review their sources of power at that time, and they certainly used it in that direction. No question about it.
Okay, we're going to go to the phones.
One of the big watershed events of Western history. Do we side with Germany against Russia? With, the evils of communism, they already killed 20 million of their own people, enslaved all these people, or do we, go with Germany? And so that was the big question, and it was decided. I think Churchill was another one of the major, but then you have to look, exactly why he made that choice, and.
Okay.
Jewish influence was important.
Very good. Let's go to a caller on line one. Go ahead, caller.
What?
Caller, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I look at it like this. The reason you don't hear white, because white already have power. White have most of the power in the world anyway.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Professor.
Well, that even if they do,
everything that's being run is mostly white, so they really don't have to express the whiteness. Like the blacks had a Muslim, and the Jews had a Jew, Arabs had a Arabs, all that.
Well, I think that whites used to have more of a sense of being white. Back, if you look in the 1920s. Whites had a strong sense of deriving from Europe, of being part of European culture, of being white, really, and going back in history to the Roman Empire, the Greeks, and so on. And I think that's what's been lost. I think that having power per se doesn't make you have a lack of ethnic consciousness. But I do think that as whites get less and less powerful in America, and it will happen, they will become more ethnically conscious, yes.
Okay, very good. Professor, I want to thank you for being with us, and it's been an interesting program, and I've definitely read a lot of what you have wrote, and just for our viewers, this is purely scientific studies. This is not a political studies. What Professor MacDonald had done, and he had done the research. And let's take it from a scientific point of view. I understand, especially like from the last caller, it's not really, we're not trying to get the white culture here or people to start calling themselves white. This was about Judaism and what Judaism, what influences it had from a scientific point of view on the 20th century. Thank you, Professor, for being with us.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, again, we wanted to talk to, it's something, this is a variety issues program. We will talk to anyone, and we will help them actually express their opinion on this program, and we welcome all opinions. And of course, some of my viewers may be now saying, what is he doing with this white thing issue? Well, it's not really, it was not about white or white being supremacist. It was about Judaism and how it influenced our lives, including the idea that being white and being proud of it is a bad thing. And that's why a lot of you white folks out there, you don't like, if you hear something talking about, white people this and white people that, you think, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to be part of this. And I think that's part of the consciousness that was created in the United States. Now, personally, I have no problem with anyone being proud of what they are. If you are white, you have every right to be proud of who you are. If you are Arab, if you are whatever you are, you have the right to assemble. You have the right to be proud of your heritage, of your culture. You have, I understand, the majority of people, actually, it is dwindling, as Dr. MacDonald have said. But, the white population in the United States, it will be below 50% soon. And it is also, with the birth rate of other cultures or other ethnic groups in the United States. For instance, the birth rates for Arabs or Eastern, let's say, cultures, not just Arabs, but Arabs and Pakistanis and Indians, and even Spanish birth rate or black birth rate is a lot more than white birth rate. So it is going to come time when we actually have different, it will be, whites will be a minority in the United States. And now, am I saying for whites to go out there and have more children? Hey, go at it. That's fine with me. Now, let's get back. We're going to be we're going to be joined very shortly with Ted Pike. We had Ted Pike here before. He is with the National Prayer Group, National Prayer Network, actually.